All right, let's dive into this psi scale theorem. And I had to look at these excerpts you sent over, and it's definitely something else, isn't it? We're going to unpack as much as we can, especially those bits you highlighted about how it kind of reframes our whole view of reality. I think that was the part you were most interested in.
It really does shake things up a bit.
Yeah, yeah.
In your notes, you mentioned how it applies to everything from these tiny quantum particles to like the entire cosmos.
It's
And
like a secret code to the universe or something, right? Like we're just starting to crack it open.
yeah, definitely. And what's really interesting is that it all starts with a pretty basic idea. Um, you know how so many philosophical journeys begin with Descartes and that I think, therefore I am bit?
Oh, right, right. The cogito. I mean, that's like philosophy 101, even if everything else is an illusion. The fact that I'm here thinking about it, I mean, that has to be real, right?
Exactly. And the size scale theorem kind of picks up where Descartes left off with this idea of anti-distinction. Think of it this way. We need distinction to analyze the world right. It's like a scientist putting a specimen under a microscope.
Right.
You have to isolate it to study it.
Right, right. Makes sense.
But anti-distinction reminds us that we're also a part of that system, that specimen, that world.
Okay, so it's like we got to zoom in and zoom out constantly. Like we got to be aware of our own perspective, but also see how we fit into the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's what the size scale theorem's all about, holding both of those truths in our minds at the same time, distinction and anti-distinction. And when you start thinking like that, it affects how we approach everything from like the laws of physics to how we treat each other even.
Okay, so this is getting pretty complex pretty fast. You mentioned physics. What are some of the practical implications for a field like that?
We'll take the concept of size scale continuum, for example, which is something the book you sent over talks about. It basically means there's no absolute biggest or smallest thing. It's a constant spectrum from the subatomic all the way up to the supergalactic. But it's not just about recognizing those different scales. It's realizing that they're all interconnected. Like the behavior of a tiny particle could, in theory, affect the formation of an entire galaxy.
Whoa, that's wild. And the book specifically mentions these three levels, right? Microcosm, mesocosm, and macrocosm. Can you maybe break those down a bit?
Sure. So imagine we have this cosmic zoom lens, right? We zoom all the way out and see the macrocosm, those vast galaxies spread across billions of light years.
Okay, I can picture it.
Zoom in a bit further, and we're in the mesocosm, our solar system, planets, life on Earth.
Mm.
Then zoom in even further, and we hit the microcosm, atoms, quarks, all that quantum stuff.
It's like those Russian nesting dolls, except with infinite layers.
And the size scale theorem says those aren't separate categories. They're levels of one continuous reality.
That's amazing. It connects so perfectly to what you were saying before about multiple perspectives. We tend to get stuck in our human-sized view of things, but this theorem forces us to think about all those other scales of existence.
Right. And that shift in perspective changes everything. Suddenly we start asking, how do quantum events affect biological processes? Or could the movements of galaxies actually influence how life evolves here on Earth?
You can't talk about scales and reality without mentioning Einstein, right? EMC2. It's basically the ultimate equation showing how energy and mass are just two sides of the same coin.
Einstein was definitely a game changer. He showed that energy and mass can transform into each other, and even more mind-blowing, that mass and energy actually warp the fabric of space-time itself.
Wait, hold on. So space-time isn't just this empty backdrop. It's actually shaped by the stuff in it.
Exactly. And the size scale theorem takes this even further with what it calls energy mass space-time. It's not that energy and mass exist in space and time, but they're actually all interwoven into one inseparable thing.
Okay, I need a metaphor here to really grasp this. It's like a tapestry, right? The
Yeah.
threads are energy and mass, and the fabric itself is space-time. You can't separate them. It's all one woven structure.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah.
It perfectly captures how the size scale theorem views reality, this interconnected web of energy, mass, space-time. And what's really fascinating is that this idea of a unified fabric connects back to the size scale continuum we were talking about earlier. It suggests that everything from the smallest quantum fluctuation to the biggest supercluster of galaxies is ultimately part of the same interconnected system.
I'm telling you, this is blowing my mind. It's not just that things exist on different scales, but those scales are constantly interacting and influencing each other through this web of energy, mass, space-time.
Exactly. And realizing that changes everything. It affects how we understand our place in the universe and the choices we make even.
Okay, before we dive into all of that, I think we need to talk about another big idea connected to the size-scale theorem, evolution. And I have a feeling we're not just talking about Darwin and finches here, right?
Right. You got it. The size scale theorem suggests that evolution isn't just about biology. It's a fundamental principle at play across every level of reality.
Wait, so are you saying things are evolving at the quantum level, at the societal level, even at the level of the entire universe?
Absolutely. And this concept of universal evolution is a key to understanding how complexity arises. Think about how AI is developing at an incredible pace, or how cities grow and adapt over time. They all seem different, but they share a common thread: evolution.
I love how this ties into your interest in how systems change over time. It's like this recursive loop, each stage of evolution builds on the one before it, creating this amazing tapestry of complexity.
You got it. And this concept of universal evolution operating across all scales gives us a new lens for understanding the world. It helps us see connections between things that seem completely unrelated. It helps us appreciate the interconnectedness of everything.
This really is reframing so many things we take for granted. But I think we need to pause here and really unpack what this means for us, for humanity and for how we understand our place in the universe. We'll come back after a short break and delve into some of the deeper philosophical implications of the size-scale theorem.
Okay, so we're back. And I'm still thinking about that whole evolution idea. It's a lot to take in, that it's not just about biology.
It really does show you just how connected everything is. And, all that interconnectedness leads to some pretty big questions about ethics.
Right, we can't just talk about the science without considering how we live in the world.
Yeah.
So how does this whole size scale thing change our understanding of morality?
What moves us away from those strict rule-based views of ethics? It's not about following a set of commandments. Instead, the size-scale theorem suggests that ethical behavior comes from understanding our interconnectedness with everything.
So like our actions don't just affect us or the people right around us, they have these ripple effects that could impact things on scales we don't even realize. Exactly. Even small choices can have huge consequences, both good and bad. It means we have a responsibility to think about how our actions affect everything, not just ourselves.
One of the articles you sent me mentioned that the size-scale theorem can change how we think about spirituality, too. And it made me wonder, does it support those traditional ideas about God, or does it challenge them?
That's a tough one, and it depends on who you ask, I guess. Some people might find that this theorem challenges their religious beliefs, while others might find it actually strengthens their faith.
I'm curious about the challenging side of things. How could this scientific concept clash with traditional religious ideas?
Well, for some, the idea that there's no absolute beginning or end to reality doesn't leave much room for a separate creator deity.
No, instead of a universe that's created by something, it just is.
Right. And the size-scale theorem also emphasizes how everything is connected, this energy-mass spacetime idea. It's harder to imagine a God that exists outside of that, acting on it from the outside. Instead, the universe is seen as self-sustaining, guided by its own internal principles.
It's like that universal evolution idea we were talking about. If the universe is always evolving and creating complexity, maybe there's no need for a divine designer.
Exactly. The very processes that create stars, planets, and life itself, those could be seen as evidence of the universe's inherent creativity without needing a supernatural being.
It sounds like we're talking about a more process-oriented view of reality instead of one that focuses on a singular creator.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's about seeing the universe as a dynamic system governed by interconnected laws and principles. But it's important to remember this interpretation doesn't necessarily invalidate all forms of spirituality.
Right. People might still hold on to the idea of a higher power or a guiding force, but maybe it's less about a personal God and more about recognizing the intelligence or interconnectedness of the universe.
Exactly. And this ties back to what we were saying about ethics. If morality comes from understanding our place within this vast web of existence, our ethical obligations come from acting in ways that promote harmony and sustainability within that web.
So it's like the difference between following rules because you're afraid of punishment versus acting ethically because you understand the bigger picture.
Right. The size-scale theorem pushes us to consider the long-term impact of our choices, realizing our actions ripple outwards and affect things far beyond our immediate sphere.
This is giving us a lot to think about, but it also raises another question for me. If the size-scale theorem challenges this idea of a personal God, does it offer any alternatives? What does it say about the meaning of life and our purpose in this huge universe?
So it doesn't exactly give us easy answers, but it does give us a powerful framework for thinking about these questions.
How so? It's hard enough to wrap my head around the size of the universe, let alone figure out what my place is in it.
Remember the size-scale continuum, that idea of zooming in and out of reality. Imagine yourself zooming all the way out, seeing Earth as just a tiny dot in this vastness.
I feel pretty insignificant just thinking about it.
But even within that vastness, we humans have a unique position. We're the only species we know of that can actually think about our place in the cosmos.
It's like we're the universe becoming aware of itself.
And that's a beautiful thought, right? And maybe that's where our purpose lies, in our ability to be conscious. We have the potential to actually influence the evolution of consciousness itself, individually and collectively.
Whoa, that's a lot of responsibility. How exactly do we contribute to something like that?
Think about everything humanity has achieved. Art, music, science, technology. These are all expressions of consciousness, and they're constantly evolving. Our creativity, our innovations, our search for understanding, those are all forces that shape consciousness.
So we're not just passive observers, we're active participants, co-creators in this grand cosmic experiment.
Exactly. And that can be a really powerful idea. It suggests our lives have meaning, not in some predetermined way, but in how we choose to interact with the universe and how we contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself.
I love that. It shifts the focus from finding answers to actively engaging with the universe.
Exactly. It's about realizing we're not isolated individuals, but integral parts of this cosmic tapestry. It's about embracing the mystery and wonder of it all and taking responsibility for our role in this unfolding story.
This conversation is really making me question everything, but honestly, I feel more energized than overwhelmed. It's like the size scale theorem isn't giving us all the answers, but it's opening up all these new possibilities.
And we'll be back after a short break to explore some of those possibilities and see what other doors this size-scale theorem might open. Okay, so we're back, and that whole idea of humans playing a part in the evolution of consciousness, I mean, that's a powerful thought, right?
It really is, and it
Yeah.
makes you think about our place in all of this. Speaking of which, there's another side to the size scale theorem we haven't really touched on yet, what it means for how we understand consciousness itself.
Right. We talked about how consciousness might be evolving, but what about what it actually is? Where does it fit into this whole model of reality as this interconnected energy mass spacetime? Yeah, that's a big one. And it's a question that people have been debating for centuries. The size-scale theorem doesn't give us a definitive answer, but it does offer a pretty unique perspective. Remember we were talking about anti-distinction before? Well, it suggests that all separations are kind of arbitrary, just matters of perspective.
So maybe consciousness isn't a separate thing, like it's not independent from the material world. Could it be that it's actually woven into the very fabric of reality?
Some physicists and philosophers are saying exactly that. They propose that consciousness could be a fundamental property of the universe, just like energy or mass. What if even the tiniest particles have some basic level of awareness, a kind of proto-consciousness?
So instead of consciousness emerging only in complex beings like us, it's
Yeah.
always been there from the very beginning, just expressing itself differently depending on the scale and complexity.
Right. And as matter comes together in more complex ways, atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, this basic awareness could scale up eventually, leading to the kind of self-reflective consciousness that we experience as humans. It fits perfectly with the size-scale theorem's emphasis on interconnectedness and evolution.
It really changes how we view consciousness, doesn't it? And it makes me wonder if consciousness is like built into the universe. Does that change how we approach science? It's not just about studying dead matter anymore, but about exploring the very nature of awareness itself.
It definitely blurs the lines between science and spirituality. Maybe as we learn more about consciousness, those two seemingly separate areas will start to merge.
The article you sent also mentioned how the size-scale theorem challenges this idea of anthropocentrism. I'm guessing that has to do with the vastness of the universe and the possibility of other intelligent life out there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea that humans are the center of everything that just doesn't hold up when you consider the sheer scale of the universe. There are scales of existence that are so much bigger than us that it seems almost ridiculous to think we're the most important thing in the universe.
Yeah, it's like that saying about there's always a bigger fish. No matter how significant we might feel, there's always something larger that puts our human perspective into perspective.
And some of those larger things could very well be other forms of intelligent life. With so many galaxies and stars out there, statistically speaking, it's unlikely that we're alone.
So not only are we not at the center in terms of physical scale, but we might not be the only intelligent beings out there either. It's a humbling thought, but also pretty exciting when you think about all the possibilities.
It's about letting go of that human-centered view
Mm.
and embracing a wider perspective.
This whole deep dive has been quite a journey. We started with Descartes and ended up talking about the nature of consciousness, the vastness of the universe, and even the meaning of life. It's a lot to process, but it's been amazing.
The size-scale theorem doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us a really helpful way of thinking about these big questions. It's like a map to uncharted territory, an invitation to keep exploring with curiosity, humility, and a sense of wonder.
So where do we go from here? What kind of impact do we want to have in this infinite size-time continuum? What kind of mark do we want to leave on the universe?
That's a question we each have to answer for ourselves. But the size-scale theorem reminds us to live with a sense of responsibility, recognizing how interconnected we are with everything. It's a beautiful reminder that we're not just isolated individuals, but active participants in this incredible cosmic story that's constantly unfolding. And to you, our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the size-scale theorem. We hope you found it as thought-provoking and inspiring as we have.